In your opinion, does this painting express a conservative worldview, a liberal worldview, neither, or both? That's going to be the basis for this video essay. And though it takes this painting as a basis, it's going to shoot off, and most of what I deal with is going to be our contemporary culture. So if you're interested in a video that looks at this painting more based on its own artistic merits and explores it aesthetically, I made a previous video that does that, and you can watch it here. That video does not really get into any subject matter that could really be considered political. So if you believe in not mixing art with politics, then you might enjoy that video more than this one. Now, we all know that people who try to sit on the fence are annoying. So, at the outset, let me clarify my position for you. My position is whatever position does the following two things. One, permits this artwork to exist, that is, does not threaten to destroy it or hide it away in a vault. And two, celebrates it, that is allowed to say, this is good. So what position is this? I think it obviously would have been the liberal position at many points in history. It's possible that it is the conservative position now, but I don't really care how my position is labeled because it is a very concrete position. It revolves around a tangible outcome and a clearly defined stance, so the label you give it is really of no importance to me. But I can imagine two contrary positions, one coming from the left and one coming from the right. And I think it is interesting as a thought experiment to consider both. I will be spending a lot more time analyzing the left-wing objection because I think it's more interesting. Why is it more interesting? Well, mostly because the right-wing objection has been, by this point in history, pretty well dissected. There's not a lot left over to analyze there. I don't think the same is true of the left-wing objection, and that's why I spend more time unpacking it. Now, most of you are going to be either liberals or conservatives, and yet I have a feeling like if you are clicking on this video, you probably agree with me that this is a good painting and it should not be destroyed or hidden away from public view. So to be perfectly clear, the two positions I am outlining are to be understood as extremist positions that relatively few people actually hold. The purpose of articulating these extremist positions is because they give the clearest voice to the fuzzier, vague sort of feelings and attitudes that permeate these two sociopolitical orientations. Think of it like a jazz purist. The jazz purist is not going to give you the clearest picture of the average fan of jazz music. He will, however, give you the clearest picture of what jazz is. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Let's start with the ultra-conservative position. The ultra-conservative will probably like the fact that there is a sweet depiction of a woman fawning over a baby, but will ultimately have to condemn this painting because it obviously sexualizes the woman and seeks to incite lust in the viewer. This is sinful. Therefore, the painting is indecent and not fit for public display. Again, how many self-identified conservatives alive today actually hold this view? Probably not that many, and I think the same is going to be true of the left liberal position I'm about to describe. This is an extreme view that most people who self-identify as left liberal will not ascribe to, but it still represents a sort of pure distilled essence of their general orientation. Just a quick note on the word liberal. There is a lot of confusion in America over this term. People often tend to use the word liberal and leftist interchangeably in America, which causes a lot of confusion about what liberalism actually is. Leftists who are more well-educated typically do not refer to themselves as liberal, especially if they identify as socialist, which is a position that tends to be in direct opposition to many liberal principles, especially those of private property and free markets. For this reason, in Europe, being a liberal is often viewed as a right-wing position. So I just want to clarify that I'm going to describe a position that I will call ultra-liberal, but it's really just to balance it with the term ultra-conservative. And in reality, I should probably be calling this position something more like uber-leftist. The term leftist has the benefit of being able to encompass many contemporary ideological developments that were not present in either liberalism or socialism prior to contemporary times. So anyway, when I say ultra-liberal, you can just translate it in your head as uber-leftist. Okay, so what is the ultra-liberal position on this painting? I posit that the ultra-liberal can't get behind this picture either, for two reasons. The first, ironically, is almost identical to that of the ultra-conservative, namely that it sexualizes the woman. It's actually hard to precisely identify the difference between their respective objections. One is along religious lines and has to do with the idea of sin. The other is along feminist lines and purportedly would not involve the idea of sin, yet for all intents and purposes, it creates a sort of taboo that becomes essentially a secularized form of sin. This objection to the sexualization and alleged objectification of women was the justification used by the Manchester Art Gallery to remove a painting by Waterhouse called Hylas and the Nymphs. This painting was extremely popular and beloved by the public, but was removed from public view and placed in storage, citing the basic feminist objection, sort of implying that there is something harmful in the male gaze, also casting shade on Victorian fantasies, etc. A YouTuber called The Authentic Observer already made an excellent video on this, and I highly recommend it if you are interested. She thoroughly dismantles the argument from the perspective of a woman who is not herself insensitive to the idea that sexualization and objectification involves problematics. Yet she still makes a very strong case for the value of the type of feminine beauty as portrayed by Waterhouse, and I would argue also portrayed by Draper. Although I would admit that Draper is a bit more overtly sexual than Waterhouse. So I am going to leave off from addressing this part of the ultra-liberal position and instead look at the other objection that I imagine they might have. And it pertains to the fact that this painting appears to highlight the connection between sex and procreation. This, to me, is the most interesting aspect of this painting. I think the ultra-liberal position sees a connection between sex and procreation as a form of oppression. This oppression is, of course, hardwired into nature, and depending on whether the ultra-liberal has a positive or negative view of nature, this could have a different set of apologetics. Of course, the primary objection is to the oppression involved in forced motherhood, whether by tacit social coercion through the pressure of strict cultural norms or actual legalistic oppression existing in ultra-conservative societies. Now, assuming we agree that neither form of actual oppression is operative in most parts of the modern West, we might expect that liberal attitudes towards motherhood would be neutral. That is, since sex has been decoupled from procreation by means of birth control and or abortion, there is no liberal imperative to place the thumb on the scale when influencing societal attitudes towards the idea of having children. That is not, however, what I see. When I look at the vast amounts of media created by left-leaning outlets, I see a ton of messaging aimed at disparaging the idea of motherhood. Within America, this might be understood as a defensive posture from the left in response to recent attempts to let individual states determine the legality of abortion. I can understand this argument, but I still don't believe that it explains the entire phenomenon. I think the left was awash in anti-natalist attitudes long before there was any rumor of Roe versus Wade being overturned. Now, that is just my feeling, so you can argue that it is based on anecdotal evidence, and that would be true. I would point out that anecdotal evidence is now accepted as valid by some sectors of the left if it is labeled as lived experience. However, the validity of lived experience seems to vary on factors of intersectionality, which means we are not on equal footing when assessing the relative value of our lived experience. So, rather than bore you with a long laundry list of reasons why I think the modern left has a very strong anti-natalist attitude, I will offer just one example that I think gives a perfect summation. The recent movie Barbie opens with a scene that parodies the opening scene of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We see a group of young girls playing with baby dolls. They are aping the various activities of domestic motherhood in a somewhat dull, ritualistic manner. Then, a giant Barbie appears in the place of the monolith from A Space Odyssey. The revelation of Barbie shows these girls how much more fun a doll can be. Glamorous, exciting, and aspiring to more than just mere motherhood. As a result, the girls begin to destroy their baby dolls, bashing their heads in. Now, you can view this scene in two different ways. It is a comical parody of Space Odyssey, but makes a serious statement about the subjugation of women prior to the era of the Civil Rights Movement. It seeks to recast Barbie as a force of women's liberation, contrary to many feminist critiques that have often alleged Barbie as both a symptom and factor of women's oppression by rigid beauty standards. However, it is also possible to view this scene in a slightly different way. It could be that what is being parodied here is actually the anti-natalist attitude that seems baked into the typical feminist orientation. I'm inclined to think that this is the more accurate interpretation. What's interesting is that either way you choose to interpret it, it still affirms my basic point. Smashing the baby dolls is a symbol for smashing the patriarchy, but the baby dolls inevitably stand in for actual babies as well. I mean, they quite literally do. That's what they were made for. The idea that comes across is motherhood equals oppression. Now again, remember, I prefer to be charitable to the director. I think she is laughing at the idea that some feminists equate motherhood with oppression, but it indicates that this attitude is real. This attitude exists. It's out there, circulating through the various media messages in our culture. To me, the director is saying that this anti-natalist attitude is silly and does not need to be part of the larger feminist project. But she acknowledges that it is there. It exists. And again, if I'm wrong and she actually embraces the anti-natalist attitude and this scene is actually meant to celebrate it, well, that's much worse, but it still proves my point. So I am going to take as axiomatic that there is an anti-natalist attitude on the left, just like there is an anti-sex attitude on the right. Furthermore, the anti-natalist attitude includes the following: a negative view of babies, and a negative view of parenthood in general and motherhood specifically. To break it down further, the negative view on babies usually includes things like statements that cast the baby as a sort of parasite on the mother, statements that emphasize the baby as a burden, and statements that babies are gross or annoying. The negative view of parenthood is more tacit. I think typically even the ultra-liberal would say that if you are going to have children, you should treat them well. So the negative view on parenthood is less about a dereliction of duty, although it certainly can lead to that, and more about casting doubt or shade on the value of choosing to become a parent in the first place. We see this pretty clearly in the DINK phenomenon. DINK stands for dual income, no kids. And it's like a hashtag you might see on various videos about young professional couples showing off their childless lifestyle. Traveling, being lazy around the house, doing spontaneous things, whatever types of things they imagine they could not do if they had the burden of being parents. And the funny thing here is the jab. Like, they could just do all these things and enjoy it, but they feel the need to insert this extra negative jab at the idea of parenthood. I'm sure they would argue that this is a response to the societal pressures to have children, though at this point, I feel like that pressure is largely imagined or projected, with the exception of some older parents innocently asking when they will have grandchildren to spoil, which may be annoying, but is hardly a form of oppression. For those who do choose to become parents, the attitude promoted seems to suggest that you should center your own needs before, or at least not after, your child's needs. Even those most extreme ultra-liberals will rarely say these sorts of things openly. It sounds pretty abhorrent when it is explicitly stated. However, it does slip out occasionally in explicit ways. The logic that justifies it relates to a phenomenon that you could call flipping received wisdom on its head. This phenomenon is not new, nor is it germane only to the left. In the Western world, you could trace it all the way back to Socrates and Jesus. Turning the other cheek is an example of flipping received wisdom on its head. That being said, the modern left does seem to have a particular obsession with flipping received wisdom on its head, which is evident, amongst other things, in the plethora of movie remakes where we discover that the traditional bad guy is actually the good guy and has been all along, and vice versa. The traditional good guy is actually the bad guy and always has been. So I think the justification for denigrating and showing disdain for the traditional parenting ideal that centers the child's needs before the parent's needs can be explained as part of that larger orientation of flipping received wisdom on his head. To illustrate this particular aspect of the ultra-liberal attitude, I'll describe a trial that occurred last month in Indianapolis. I believe that both the judge as well as the mother on trial express the ultra-liberal position that places the mother's needs above those of her child and centers her own experience as more important than those of her children. The woman had smothered her 2-month-old baby to death because the baby would not stop crying. She was high on meth at the time. Her 3-year-old daughter witnessed the murder and described it to family members, saying her mom put a pillow over the baby's face because she was crying. Judge Mark Stoner found the mother not guilty. As he read out the verdict, he added these words to the mother: "I do hope that you will take the opportunity to get the counseling you need, to get the counseling for the children that they need, that you learn from this behavior, and hopefully that the rest of the community learns from this behavior, that you cannot go out and party on the weekends and be with children." The not guilty verdict seems to hang upon the mother's claim that she did not intend to kill her baby, only to silence her. The judge appears to have simply taken her at her word on this matter. The judge does not seem to be concerned with delivering justice to the child who was killed, nor to the child who had to watch her mother kill her sister. He is privileging the mother's experience here, prioritizing her and centering her. He seems to suggest that it is understandable that she would want to go out partying on the weekend, but it is a naughty thing to do unless she has arranged for childcare beforehand. The term bleeding heart liberal was coined to describe someone who will make endless excuses to evade blame and punishment for criminal behavior. I think it is apt to label this judge as a bleeding heart liberal. He is also an ultra liberal, as I have defined it. The curious thing is that he seems to be applying the standard liberal attitude towards abortion to a child who had already been born. Granted, she had only been born 2 months prior to being killed. So one has to wonder whether the proximity to the birth event somehow lessens the crime in the mind of the judge. I wanted to avoid talking about abortion, but I guess I can't. After all, the political debate around abortion does seem to be the ultimate source of the anti-natalist attitude on the left. I actually support the right of a woman to have an abortion. My position on this is not extremely firm. It is a position I hold tentatively and with reservations. But I cannot ignore the fact that it seems abhorrent to me to suggest the death penalty for a woman who has terminated the life of a zygote within her womb, while at the same time I am perfectly fine with the death penalty for a woman who intentionally murders a 2-year-old child. I can see on an intellectual level why the distinction between a zygote and a 2-year-old involves drawing an arbitrary line somewhere, but this knowledge does not change what I feel in my heart. And on this issue, I trust my heart. I don't feel that a woman who terminates her pregnancy at an early stage deserves any form of legal punishment, and I certainly don't feel that she deserves anything remotely like the level of punishment she would deserve for murdering a 2-year-old. But this exact same line of reasoning, questioning the validity of drawing an arbitrary line in the process of human development from a zygote to a fully formed baby, this exact same line of reasoning is weaponized by the ultra-liberal just in the opposite direction. They will argue that the abortion should be legal far past the stage of viability, right up to the due date, for any reason whatsoever. If a woman wakes up a day before she is due to give birth and just says, "Nah, I'm not feeling it," then it is her inviolable human right to terminate the pregnancy, even at that late stage. Because the ultra-liberal has seized upon abortion rights as absolute and inviolable, they have the same air of righteousness and zealotry that the conservatives have for their cause. The conviction of righteous zealotry ultimately leads them to denigrate the value of a baby's life, because affirming it brings them too dangerously close to acknowledging that the conservative argument might have some solid grounding. Don't concede an inch of territory. In fact, you may need to even push farther than you actually want to in order to claim the territory you feel entitled to. This logic could lead the ultra-liberal to argue that the human infant is not really aware of itself as a distinct individual entity for the first few weeks anyway. Perhaps then a woman should have the right to terminate the life of an infant in the first few weeks. We could call it a post-birth abortion. And speaking of viability, is it really true that a 2-year-old can survive without her mother's help? If not, then isn't viability a meaningless term? Thus, the argument proceeds. The end result is the denigration of babies and children in the name of procuring abortion rights. I hope what I have demonstrated here is that it is not necessary to maintain an anti-natalist, anti-child, anti-parenting attitude in order to affirm some level of a woman's right to choose, but also that this sort of anti-natalist attitude is actively being propagated. Okay, now we finally come to the issue of sex positivity. The great irony in all of this is that the same left liberal culture that denigrates the natural product of sex, babies, is also the biggest proponent of sex so long as it is understood to be both practically and philosophically cut off from that natural function. So let's consider the term sex positive, which came into vogue on the left some years ago. Here is the first sentence in the Wikipedia entry on the sex positive movement. The sex positive movement is a social and philosophical movement that seeks to change cultural attitudes and norms around sexuality, promoting the recognition of sexuality in the countless forms of expression as a natural and healthy part of the human experience, and emphasizing the importance of personal sovereignty, safer sex practices, and consensual sex free from violence or coercion. If you continue to read this Wikipedia article, it goes on at some length describing all the various facets that are supposed to be nested under this big tent. It becomes so broad and so all-encompassing that eventually the term sex positive begins to feel too cumbersome to use. If the term simply meant something like having a positive feeling towards sex as a healthy and beautiful, as opposed to a dark or shameful, part of human life, Then I think more ordinary people could get on board with it. But as it is, the term sex positive is so broad that it feels like you don't really know what you're signing up for when you're using it. For instance, does sex positivity include so-called minor attracted people? To be sex positive, do you have to approve of people who eat human feces as a kink? What exactly are we signing up for by using this term? And yet, for all its focus on inclusivity, there is not a single mention that I could see on the Wikipedia article of the fact that the natural function of sex is the creation of babies. There is no indication anywhere in the article that sex has any sort of link to procreation. Now, many people are going to try to misconstrue what I am saying here, so let me be perfectly clear. I am not saying that these two things, sex and the creation of babies, cannot be practically decoupled. They can, obviously, be decoupled in practice. What I am saying is that they cannot be philosophically decoupled. And when I say that they cannot be philosophically decoupled, I do not mean that they cannot be morally decoupled. Whether or not they can be morally decoupled depends on the particular morality attached to the question of sex and procreation. These will differ from culture to culture and person to person, so obviously sex and procreation can be decoupled from a particular moral vantage point. I think we are all familiar with the ultra-conservative position that insists there is a moral imperative not to decouple sex from procreation. What I want to highlight is that there has now developed on the political left a moral imperative that is the exact inverse of this, a moral imperative to decouple sex from procreation. To me, this position is as repugnant as the one it seeks to counter. Consider the difference between the two following statements. If we can, we may, versus if we can, we must. Each one is appropriate and applicable to different situations. For instance, choosing flavors of ice cream in a parlor is a situation where if we can, we may is applicable. Can we choose chocolate? It depends on whether or not they have it. If we can, we may. Choosing to rescue someone buried by rubble after an earthquake is a situation where if we can, we must is more applicable. Proponents of sex positivity currently seem to subscribe to the notion that decoupling sex from procreation is a if we can, we must type of situation. It is the inverse of the ultra-conservative position that we must not under any circumstance. And it totally misses the third option of if we can, we may. Why this matters has to do with the implications that flow from holding such a position, which I will get into shortly. But before I do, let me clarify one more thing pertaining to if we can, we may versus if we can, we must. There are plenty of situations that call for some gray area between these two positions, like saving money. In that case, it may be more applicable to say, if we can, we should. Or even the more tepid version, if we can, it is probably advisable to. I bring this up because it pertains to the distinction between a personal choice, say the choice of one person to use contraception or the choice to try to get pregnant, as opposed to a collective choice, like the choice to make contraception widely available. As we move from the personal to the public, the issue of if we can, we may becomes more amenable to a position of if we can, we must. However, I would hold out that there will be dire consequences that flow from a minor adjustment between attitudes of if we can, we must, and a less imperative attitude of if we can, we probably ought to. Holding the more agnostic view allows for a more neutral attitude, and a neutral attitude is the appropriate one for a governmental policy in a society where a plurality of views are permitted. Furthermore, in this specific case, it allows for the maximum freedom of personal choice without the negative effects of promoting an implicitly anti-natalist attitude as the one of moral superiority. Here it is fair to ask, does it really follow that believing in the moral imperative to decouple sex from procreation inevitably leads to an anti-natalist attitude and actually goes a step further by promoting an anti-natalist attitude as a position of moral superiority? I would argue that it does. I think the belief that we must decouple sex from procreation cannot but insinuate that procreation is a negative that must be removed from the positive that is sex. Again, it is the inverse of the ultra-conservative attitude that sex is a negative that unfortunately cannot be decoupled from the positive that is procreation. If you understand that sex and procreation cannot be philosophically decoupled, then you will have a positive feeling towards both. If you believe that babies are good and beautiful, then you must acknowledge that the act that creates them is also good and beautiful. Conversely, if you believe that sex is good and beautiful, then you must also acknowledge that procreation is also good and beautiful, since it is this that gave you the gift of sex. And even if you choose not to have children yourself, you can still maintain a positive feeling in your heart towards them and a sense of gratitude towards those who choose to embrace parenthood. Because at the end of the day, whether they were good at it or not, you owe them your existence. And if you feel that this existence is not worth it, and that sex for you is merely an act of defiance to be rebelliously flung in the face of nature, well then, you are anti-natalist and you've just proven my point. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video essay format, let me know in the comments below. I don't think that this type of content will ever make up more than maybe just like 10% of what I put out, because I do want to focus on art and the visual aspects of art. And this obviously was quite a departure from that. But it felt important for me to say these things because I realized that I was afraid to say them. I was afraid to put out my opinion, and I don't want to get into the habit of curtailing my views and beliefs just because I'm afraid of losing subscribers or not appealing to the widest possible audience. That being said, I obviously do want to build up my subscriber base as much as possible. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. Again, thank you so much for watching or listening, and ciao for now.